Welcome to this lecture in our Institute for Philosophy and Religion series on the contemporary face of suffering. My name is Alan Spade. I'm director of the Institute. I'm so glad so many of you could make it, despite the Red Sox competition and all of the pre-Halloween festivities that everybody's engaged in. Good to see you all. I have just a quick announcement before we start about the next event in our series, which will be next Wednesday. Arthur Kleinman from Harvard Medical School, who is, as many of you know, one of the founders and leading lights of the narrative medicine movement, among other things, will be speaking. He's been writing lately on the topic of caregiving. He's been a caretaker. He was a caretaker for the last few years of his wife's life as she suffered Alzheimer's. And he'll be speaking next week on social suffering and caregiving, the ground of moral life. That's 5 o'clock here next Wednesday in this room. A reminder, of course, that you can follow us in the Institute online. We have a blog at bu.edu/IPR. Also, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter. Please join us for extended conversation as you're able. Our speaker tonight, in the face of all of this Red Sox activity in Boston, is Dean Zimmerman, who is professor of philosophy at Rutgers. Dean is the author of numerous articles on metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of religion, and is editor of Oxford Studies in Metaphysics. He has written on such issues, and this is just a sample. If you look at his website, it's truly impressive, the range of topics he's written on. Such issues as property and substance dualism, presentism and the philosophy of time, on the notions of personhood and material constitution. With Peter van Inwagen, he is the author of Persons, Human and Divine, and the editor of Metaphysics, The Big Questions. And with Michael Liu, editor of the Oxford Handbook of Metaphysics. He's also co-editor of the Oxford Studies in Metaphysics with Karen Bennett, and he's the director of a biennial summer workshop called Metaphysical Mayhem, and of the somewhat tamer-sounding St. Thomas Summer Workshops and Logos Philosophical Theology Workshops. He's currently writing a book on the philosophy of religion for the Princeton Foundations of Philosophy series. Somehow, in all of this, he finds time to play keyboard for a band called Jigs and the Pigs. Google them, and you'll find the answer to the question, what kind of rock music does an anti-Molinist play? Pretty good stuff, actually. Dean was here at the Institute a couple of years for a symposium on Mark Johnston's work. We're delighted to have him back tonight to talk about some of his own work at the moment. His topic tonight concerns an old, but let us say persistent question in the philosophy of religion. How can a loving God allow suffering? His title is Gratuitous Evils and Organic Unities. Please welcome Dean Zimmerman.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me back. I had a great time when I was here last time, and I'm really happy to be here again on such an exciting night. I hope some of that excitement spills over into this talk. However, it's going to be your typical sort of analytic philosopher's talk. So, as somebody who's with a family member who has Alzheimer's, I would much rather be here for the next talk you mentioned and hear something really practical and useful and profound. Instead, I'm going to chop away at the problem of evil and look at one particular form of it and consider at a pretty abstract level the ways in which you might respond to it. So everyone should have a handout. I'll be relying on that quite a bit. 1, 2, 3, 4 gives you the rough structure of the talk. I'll see if I can keep track of where we are and let you know when we shift. I'm going to start out with a very vague statement of a very intuitive idea. Intuitive idea being that there's a big problem with supposing that God allows a certain kind of evil, namely evil that deserves to be called gratuitous. Now, in statements of the problem of evil, whether this or others, evil tends to mean not like nasty, moral kind of evil. It just means bad stuff. So anything really that seems suboptimal, that seems like, gee, this wouldn't be here if there was a really good guy in charge of everything. Any item like that, you can pick it out and say, that, were there a God, would constitute a bad thing that shouldn't be here. And then you can run an argument from evil on the basis of that bad thing. Excuse me. So the bad thing might be some pain, suffering, mental anguish, but it could be something like ignorance of important matters that really we ought to know about, or immoral behavior, established vices that people have, things like that. So we'll start out with a very vague meaning of gratuitous evil, not really explaining what it means, just sort of bad stuff that somehow doesn't seem to be playing a role in any larger good that requires it. So that's the basic idea of gratuity. It's just not necessary. There's more than you need. Even if you need a little of this badness for some good thing, so maybe it's good that there's a little bit of scary stuff so that we can display courage, surely not things that are that scary, and so on. So gratuitous is supposed to mean more than you would really need for any good that you could suppose is involved with this bad thing. And then you run this argument on your handout there. First premise, if there exists a God who is all-powerful and all-knowing and also perfectly good and benevolent, there would be no gratuitous evils. Second premise, there are some gratuitous evils. And here one can point to particular things. The particular painful death of this child, or the particular suffering of an animal. Bill Rowe talks about this deer that is injured in a forest fire and dies slowly and horribly. So pick some bad thing that doesn't seem in any obvious way like it's hooked up with some larger good that requires it, and use that in the argument. Conclusion, there does not exist an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good and benevolent God. Now I want to consider this argument in sort of well, in a very abstract way. Now, actual pain and suffering, actual cases of terrible vices, and actual cases of horrible ignorance that leads to stupid stuff. You know, these are mind-boggling and painful to think about. And it's going to turn out that I think one of the right things for someone who continues to believe in this kind of a God to say is going to be, I don't know. I don't know what the point of this is exactly. But let's abstract away and try to be a little bit less emotional than we naturally are when we think about the particular cases that we've encountered ourselves, or that we know others have encountered. It's difficult to do that, and it can seem sometimes wrong. And you have certain theologians who've said it is wrong always, and so you shouldn't do this. Don't think about the problem of evil, at least not in this sort of abstract way, because it's sort of obscene to do so. Well, I don't think that, because obviously I wrote this paper about it, so I'm going to carry on. But it's easy to see, in a certain frame of mind, why it should seem obscene to resist this sort of argument. I have many friends who take the argument to be so obviously valid, and its premises so obviously true, that they regard continued belief in God by sane, educated people as a great and terrible mystery. They just don't understand it. So Gideon Rosen and I are friends. He's a professor at Princeton. We had a kind of conversation, public conversation at Rutgers about this topic, and I asked him to do it. We met ahead of time and talked about it. and got there and did our thing. And you know, it gradually became clear that he just couldn't understand, you know, how anybody could still believe this stuff. And he said, look, well, this, he said, I grew up in, you know, family, and I went to school, and I went to college, and I never met an adult person who actually believed this stuff until I was late in grad school. And then I was stunned. Now, you know, on some level, he must have realized that there's people all over the place who still believe this stuff, and you can't really think that they're all crazy, but it feels to him just unbelievable that people still believe this stuff. And let me try to, you know, sort of convey the sense that someone like Gideon has. I mean, it's sort of like the sense I get when I've seen a guy that I knew, I've read his books, I respect him, and so on, and suddenly he's defending conspiracy theories about 9/11. And he doesn't seem to have lost his mind. He doesn't seem to be any less rational in some general sense. But the reaction I have to that is rather like the reaction that I get from Gideon. He says, to adapt a story from Gideon, a rational adult educated believer today is, he thinks, like someone who sees his neighbor beating his child. But because the man is an upstanding citizen, keeps his promises, gives money to charitable causes, looks honest, and so on, the neighbor concludes that, oh, there must be some explanation for this. It can't be just that the guy's a bastard. Even though he behaves upright, you know, in these other contexts, he's actually a horrible guy, at least with respect to the way he treats his child. Well, he thinks that if you see this happening, you just know that the guy is a child abuser. And to pretend that, oh, there must be some explanation, it's just either you're too afraid to stand up to the guy, or you're just insensitive to certain kinds of very, very bad things, or something. But there's something wrong with you. Now, because we're talking about a case in which the alleged child abuser, in this case it's God, it's questionable whether the being exists. In fact, the point of the argument is to show that there is no such being. We should adapt the story a little bit. Make it the case that you're a teacher, and your teacher in elementary school, this child keeps coming to school with mysterious bruises and injuries. The child comes to school and seems neglected. The child is wasting away, and so on. Now, what are you going to naturally assume? You're going to naturally assume the parents are horrible. Well, and if you go to the house and you don't see parents around, eventually you're going to conclude, well, either the parents are terrible, or maybe there's no parents at all. This poor child is sort of making it on their own, and getting into trouble and whatnot. And obviously you should do something, and to say, well, I'm sure things, you know, there must be some explanation. That's just to be incredibly morally insensitive to the evidence that you're getting. And that's how it seems like, that's how religious believers seem to some of the people who push this style of argument. Now, I think we should be a little suspicious about this. I mean, as I said, you know, even if you don't grow up in a religious setting, even if you don't meet any seriously religious people all through college, you've got to, you know, realize that there are many, many morally sensitive, not stupid people who have believed in God and have not been ignorant about the amount of suffering there is and about what it's like. In fact, they've known a lot more about it than I have, certainly. Most of us have not suffered as horribly as many, many people who have been morally sensitive, smart, believers in God. Right? So something's going on. Something must be going on. And it can't be as simple as, well, they're all either too stupid to follow this very simple argument. I mean, it's not on the board, it's on your handout. The very simple argument on your handout, all of you can see that it's a logically valid argument. Right? You'd have to be, you know, you'd have to really not be paying attention to notice that it's a decent argument. And these aren't people who have completely transformed values where they think that pain is good and ignorance is good and you know, stuff like that. So we have reason to be suspicious of whether the right and proper reaction to the facts of widespread and hard to explain suffering should really be the kind of reaction that that you would have to the child who's obviously being abused or neglected. Let me read you another story. This is how Eleanor Stump, who is going to come and speak later in this series, this is how she thinks someone like Gideon Rosen is responding to the facts of suffering. Eleanor Stump thinks that people who have that reaction, who think it's as obvious as the teacher who witnesses neglect or abuse of the child, they are, she says, like avuncular Martians whose sole knowledge of human life on Earth comes just from videotape footage of medical treatments taking place within a large city hospital. Imagine how the doctors who run the hospital must look to such a Martian. The Martian sees patients being given drugs that make them sick and wretched. He sees patients having their limbs amputated or their internal organs cut out, and he hears the groans of those recovering from surgery. He sees patients dying in the hospital, including those dying as medical teams are doing things to them. And he observes the grief of their families and friends. This litany of miseries could continue ad nauseum. The Martians, seeing all this, will be filled with horror and with moral indignation at the doctors who plainly allow the suffering when they are not, in fact, actively causing it. Any suggestion that the doctors are actually benevolent toward their patients will be met by the Martians with scorn and with incredulity that we would have the face to try advancing such a claim. The Martian knows what he has seen. We can try telling him that the patients are in the hospital in the first place only because they are sick, and he will reply indignantly that in very many cases there was no sign of sickness in them that he could see when they came into the hospital. The signs of sickness appeared only after the doctors went to work on them. We can explain to him that sicknesses in question often take specialized skills, which only the doctors have to diagnose, and he'll dismiss our explanation with disdain as special pleading. We can tell him that without the treatments, the patients would be sicker or would even die, and he will point out that many of the patients he saw died apparently just because of the doctor's treatments. We can respond that on the contrary, many of the patients are in fact cured, and they live a long time outside the hospital. And then the Martian will turn on us with withering moral disgust at such pie-in-the-sky nonsense as the notion of life outside the hospital. Now, if we wanted to make the analogy tighter in the way that I did with the other case, you can suppose that the videos that the Martians see are videos of people wheeling other people into surgery rooms, and then videos of robotic surgery. So it's not clear who's in control of the robotic arms. Perhaps the humans have been enslaved by their robots, and there are no human doctors. Or perhaps there are humans running the show, and they're evil. The hypothesis that kind doctors are running the show will seem implausible to the Martians if the Martians lack enough knowledge of human illness, the role of hospitals, and life outside of the hospitals. I'm going to crank up the Jigs and the Pigs. Jiggs gets all the credit for Jigs and the Pigs because he wrote all these songs back in the 80s. You can come to the show. All right. Similarly then, let's see how I did that already. All right. Pointing out is in different epistemic situations with respect to the child who may or may not have parents, to the doctors or the robots who may or may not be evil. So the teacher is there must be a reason that these marks must be from some medical treatment that the child is getting. I'm sure the parents are giving the child enough food. There must be some medical problem, and that's why the child is becoming unhealthy. Well, now you could have somebody who's in a very different epistemic situation with respect to the child in the presence or absence of parents. So suppose there are no parents, the child is getting in trouble, being injured, and making it on his own. Nevertheless, somebody could be in a situation where it's perfectly reasonable for them to think the child has parents, the parents are good, and so on. So if a teacher just meets the child for the first time, hasn't seen any of the signs of abuse, the child says, I have great parents, they really love me, and so on. And then this teacher, that very day, is in the lounge, and an extremely gossipy teacher who cannot be relied upon, typically, says, you know what, I think that Timmy has no parents at all, or if he does, they're horrible. Well, this person is perfectly in their rights in thinking, no, he's fine. Right? Now, as the person learns more, then they're no longer in that situation. So they were wrong, but they were reasonable and wrong. Similarly, in the case of the Martians. In the original story, the Martians are reasonable in their condemnation of the doctors, if such there be. If they learn more about the non-obvious diseases that people have and the ways to treat them, and if they learn more about what goes on outside of hospitals, they're going to see the thing in a completely different way. So they, too, could be totally reasonable in supposing that there's tons of gratuitous evil going on in that hospital, and if there's doctors in charge, they're terrible people. So they could be totally reasonable, these Martians. So people, different people, can be in different epistemic situations with respect to the question whether there is gratuitous evil and whether or not it's of a sort that totally rules out the existence of God. That, anyway, is, I submit that for your consideration, anyway. All right, let's see. There's no clock in here, is there? But I don't think that means I can go as long as I like. I started about when? Okay. All right, so I'm going to skip over some things. So let's move on to typical moves in theodicy, number 2. What I want to do is just trot out some trite, but not altogether implausible things that people tend to say, just to give you a flavor for the ways in which theodicies tend to be constructed, and then we'll see how this argument the one that I keep gesturing towards, but it's on your handout. The way people are going to respond to it who want to resist the conclusion. It's not. So, yeah, so 1, 2, 3, 4 just represent the different parts of the talk, and the handout is of no help to you in keeping track of where you are. Right, so that is a defect of this handout. All right, so typical elements in a theodicy or a defense. Now first let me say, there's this distinction that's typically made between giving a theodicy, justifying the ways of God to humanity, or merely giving a defense. And the thought is, and this is a rather artificial distinction for a spectrum of things that you could be doing, the thought is that when you're giving a theodicy, you're saying what you think God's real reasons are for allowing this, that, and the other kind of bad stuff. So a theodicy is supposed to be put forth in a spirit of confidence about the actual facts concerning the point of this kind of suffering, that kind of pain, this sort of ignorance, and so on. A mere defense, on the other hand, is supposed to be a just so story. For all you know, this particular kind of good could be the thing that's served by this particular kind of evil or bad stuff. There's a real thin soup kind of defense, which says it's just logically possible that this suffering of this person serves such and such a goal. Of course, it's totally implausible, but right, that's a very thin soup defense, and I'm not really interested in that. It might be useful for some purposes, but it's not very useful when confronting an argument like this. So I'm more interested in defenses that are closer to being real theodicies. Defenses in which you point to a certain kind of good which we know can require certain kinds of bad stuff, and it's not totally implausible to suppose that at least some of the bad stuff we actually see is serving that good. At least if you assume that there's a God and so on, this would be a reasonable thing. That is enough to mount a defense of this sort of argument, which I again point to that handout there. It provides a defense against this sort of argument because it undermines your reasons to believe the premises. Okay. First element of theodicies that is present in most that you'll run into these days, free will. Free will is supposed to be a very good thing, and it's supposed to be not good just sort of by itself, but it's supposed to be good because it's necessary for a bunch of other good stuff, including moral responsibility, the development of genuine virtues, and so on. So the thought typically is this. Of course you can have creatures who always do the right thing. They're called automatons, you know. God could create such beings, things that can't go wrong. Of course God could create free creatures that could do this, could do that, but always good stuff. And they would be good in their way as well. But again, they would be, with respect to moral choices and moral responsibility, relevantly like automatons. What's important is that if you want moral responsibility and the things that come along with it that are very good, including the development of virtue, what's important is that you have creatures who can choose between good and evil. It can choose good things as well as bad things. And it's also important, this is a typical move, it's also important that this freedom isn't just, you know, you've got these competing desires, sometimes you choose one way, sometimes you choose the other way, and every time it just doesn't really make any difference to what kind of person you are. The point of free will is that you become partly responsible for the kind of person you are. If you get created, set up, wound up, and there's only one way you can go, you're not responsible for the sort of person you are at all. If you have a certain amount of freedom to choose between good and evil, and if this has a significant long-term effect on the kind of person you are, well then you have a genuinely moral agent, you can have genuinely moral virtues and vices. A creature that looks virtuous but is really just created that way and wound up and set to go might be a very good thing, but it wouldn't be a moral agent, and its good habits would not be moral virtues. That's typical theodicy for you. Some people find that very plausible. I find that very plausible. Other people find it completely implausible, and this tends to be, you know, the compatibilists and incompatibilists about free will tends to be the dividing line there. Okay, so that's one move. What other moves? Well, if there's going to be genuine choices between good and bad and so on, we're going to have some selfish motives, selfish inclinations. We're going to have some passions that pull us in the wrong way. We're also going to have to be able to understand the difference between right and wrong, at least dimly, and have the power to do something about how we respond to these very different inclinations and pulls. That means we have to start out with some bad inclinations. Even if you believed in a literal Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, you would have to suppose that they were ignorant of very important things. It's clear that they were in the story. You'd also have to suppose that they had selfish and prideful motives already when they're supposed to have been innocent. So you've got bad stuff built into the story already in order to get free agency. And from my point of view, it doesn't much matter whether it's built in there in human beings created ex nihilo, or if our passions are, our negative passions are, what I believe they are, the result of evolution. They're shared with animals. So one way or another, the free will defender says, you gotta have some inclinations that pull you towards selfishness and away from what you know you should be doing. So there's got to be some of that stuff. What else? Well, there's also a good question here about why God isn't more obvious. Why is God hidden? You can run an argument of the sort that's on your handout from gratuitous evil. You can run an argument like that from gratuitous hiddenness. If there were a God, it would be important that we know this. We should have information about this. Lots of people believe different things about God. Lots of people don't believe God exists. Lots of them must be wrong. So God, if God exists, is not obvious to everybody all the time. Now, of course, plenty of people do think that God's obvious to them most of the time. Perhaps a majority of people alive today think that God's existence is kind of obvious. In fact, I know that it's much more than a majority of people today. Still, the fact that people believe different things mean if there is such a God, did I say that right? Perhaps the fact that people believe different things about God means that even if God is obvious, some of them are wrong, and so God is to some extent hidden. And of course, many, many people just don't think that God's existence is obvious at all. So God is to some extent hidden. The free will defender has something to say about this as well. If you want creatures who are really choosing between right and wrong in a way that is significant for the development of virtues and vices, then they are only going to be free if God is, to some extent, hidden, or if God's nature is, to some extent, hidden, or if they are irrational. And if they're acting irrationally, then this is not interesting moral behavior. If they don't really understand right and wrong, that's then, to that extent, their decision isn't that significant. If they think that God doesn't care about right and wrong, well, that's really bad. But if they had all of those things, rationality, they knew right and wrong, they knew God cared incredibly about right and wrong if God existed, and if God's existence was as obvious to them all the time as the existence of all of you are, the existence of all of you is to me right now, then you couldn't do anything wrong. Right? I mean, if God's existence, nature, power, his real concern and care for you, if all of that was in your face, it would be very, very difficult to choose between right and wrong. So God's existence has to be, for a time at least, to some extent, non-obvious. That's another element in traditional free will theodicies. Other elements. Another relevant one is, okay, granted, you got to have moral choices in order to develop moral character. You have to be able to choose between what you think is evil and good. But God could stop the evil at the choice all the time. And there the problem seems to be, well, yeah, God could if each of us lived in a sort of dream world where we thought we were hurting people, but we weren't actually. But if we're going to be living in social groups where we're responsible for one another, where I bear some responsibility for you and you for me, and all of the other facts about our relationships that depend upon this, then I have to be able to help as well as harm other people. If nothing that I could possibly do could make any difference to the well-being of my wife or my kids, there was nothing that they wanted or cared about that depended upon me at all, what would our relationship be like? It would completely alter the nature of our relationships with one another. So, again, as a part of typical free will theodicy, there has to be some badness that extends beyond the bad choice in order for us to really be moral agents in a morally significant social setting. Okay, now I don't expect all that to be super convincing, especially the compatibilists in the crowd, but those, I take it, are some of the most plausible moves that can be made by way of theodicy or defense. Now, let's see what somebody who makes those kind of moves should be saying about this argument. First of all, let's think about what gratuitous and evil are supposed to mean in this argument. Evil, of course, just means bad stuff. There's a lot of debate in normative ethics, in value theory, about the fundamental subjects of goodness and badness, and whether the most interesting fundamental notion of goodness and badness is intrinsic goodness and badness, intrinsic value, or final goodness, final badness, final value. There's a distinction that's made there. The intrinsic goodness of something is sort of what it's worth all by itself, ignoring everything else around it, roughly. The intrinsic, the final goodness of something, or the final value of something is its value thought of as an end to be pursued. So it might be that the most relevant notion here is final value. states of affairs which are in and of themselves worth pursuing, though they may not be completely intrinsic to the things that have them. This isn't going to be super important, but in any case, in value theory, it's typically assumed that there's something that bears a very fundamental kind of goodness and badness. And when we're talking about gratuitous evil, we're talking about things that have badness, whatever this kind of basic badness is, and they don't need to for any larger good purpose. Now, I tend to think of these things as, I tend to take it that the best subject is states of affairs rather than chunky objects. A state of affairs is like my touching the podium, my sitting in a chair, the Red Sox entering entering Fenway Park, and so on. Something or other that could be the case. And some of these are good, some of them are bad. And I guess I'll just work with that, with that thought, that it's states of affairs. Or you could think of them as facts or events or situations or circumstances. Those are the kinds of things that are good and bad in the basic sense that we're interested in. A reason to take them rather than individuals is because if you've got an individual, whether it's in a substance, an event, or something, something that has many, many properties, it can be good in some respects, bad in other respects. So if you've got Hitler, and Hitler is kind to puppies, let's say. I have no reason to think that Hitler was, but suppose Hitler was. It's certainly quite conceivable that he was. Well, that's a respect in which even Hitler was good, even though in all these other aspects or respects, Hitler was very bad. So there's the state of affairs of Hitler's having this positive reaction to this cute furry animal and being nice to it. Okay, that's a good state of affairs, but it doesn't count for anything in the larger scheme of things when you ask how good was Hitler. The other states of affairs involving Hitler just wash it out. Okay, so it feels like things can be good or bad in virtue of things can be both good and bad in virtue of different states of affairs into which they enter. Okay. Now, what does gratuitous mean here? There are two ways in which, in late 19th, 20th century up to the present discussions, two ways in which gratuitousness has been defined or considered. One of them takes off from Moore's notion of an organic unity. And you can find this idea being made use of by Roderick Chisholm in his paper, The Defeat of Good and Evil, which was an APA presidential address back in, I think, 1968 or something. G.E. Moore thought, and others have thought, that there are such things as organic unity, where these are wholes that have a value which is not identical with the sum of the values of the parts. That was the basic idea. That's on your handout, there's the notion mere sum, bad definition. Okay? So the bad definition just says, well, a mere sum is a case where the value of the whole is not identical with the sum of the value of the parts, or is identical, rather, with the sum of the values of the parts. That's only a good definition if you think that parts includes just some kind of atomic elements that don't overlap. So if you look at that little diagram, you got you got three things, A, B, and C, that make up a rectangle. And A is worth 1, B is worth 1, C is worth 1. The value of the whole is worth 3. You could think of it as charges, maybe negative charge, negative charge, negative charge. You get 3, right? People who are talking about organic unities are thinking of value as kind of like charge. It should typically add up, but what they think is, in some odd cases or interesting cases, it doesn't. Now, if you counted that thing D, which is composed of B and C, if you counted that as a part, and you defined mere sum as a case in which the value of the whole is identical with the sum of the value of the parts, well, that's not going to count as a mere sum, because you're going to get 1, 2, 3, and then you got to add D, which is worth 2, so it'll be 5. Oh, the value of the whole is less than the sum of the value of the parts. Well, no, that's not what we meant when we were talking about a mere sum. We want you to count non-overlapping parts that exhaust the whole thing. And you don't have to suppose that there are ultimate atoms in order to suppose that you have mere sums. You could have some stuff that was infinitely divisible, parts within parts, and the parts have smaller and smaller amounts of mass, let's say, but there's no minimum. You could still have additivity. Such things could still count as mere sums, so long as for every way of dividing it up where you don't have any overlapping parts and you don't leave out anything, the sum of the values of the parts is equal to the value of the whole. So a better definition is the second one. The value of the whole is identical with the sum of values of any set of non-overlapping parts, such that the whole has no part that fails to overlap any of them. An organic unity, then, is going to be a case where you don't have a mere sum in that sense. It's on your handout there. And a case of organic unity is going to be what is called defeated evil on the handout. So the distinction between a mere sum and an organic unity allows us to make this distinction between evils that are merely balanced off and ones that are defeated. So a merely balanced off evil is one which satisfies that definition on your handout there. E is an evil that's merely balanced off by a greater good if there's if and only if, and you just say it with a little more F in it. It's merely balanced off if E is a bad part of a mere sum that is good. E is an evil that's defeated within a greater good if E is a bad part of an organic unity that is good. These are kind of rough and ready definitions, but they give you the idea. They depend upon our being able to tell when good and bad things overlap, what are the real parts of them, which parts overlap, and so on. It gets to be very, very tricky if you think states of affairs are the right subjects for fundamental value. But let's set that to one side and suppose we can make sense of this. There's another sense of gratuitous besides merely being balanced off. Okay, so one way you could run the argument is there's evil that's merely balanced off. If there was a good God, there wouldn't be evil that's merely balanced off. And so there's no such being. So one thing you could mean by gratuitous is it's merely outweighed by something else. And if something's merely outweighed, you should have just left it out if it's bad. But another thing that you can mean by gratuitous is what I'm calling on the handout there, counterfactually defined notion of gratuitous evil. E is a gratuitous evil in this sense. If E could be removed and changing things as little as possible, consistently with that removal, the result would be a better world that's almost exactly the same elsewhere with goods of the same kinds. This is not at all equivalent to the notion of merely balanced off evil. You can have defeated evil, which is nevertheless gratuitous in this counterfactual sense. So suppose you've got two things that make up a larger whole. Look at the list on the right there. You've got a bad thing, it's worth -5, whatever this badness scale is. You got a good thing that's worth 10. The whole of the two is worth actually 100. Okay, well that's an organic unity for you. And the evil there, -5, is clearly defeated in this larger whole. But suppose you could have -2.5 of the same kind of evil mixed with the very same +10 good, and you'd still get 100. Well, that evil would be defeated as well. And what if you could have even less of that evil, -1.75 of it, and 10 of the good, and you'd still get 100, and so on. So suppose there's no minimum amount, you just need some of this evil, and you're going to get a whole that's overall worth 100. Well, in that case, even though if God allowed any of these, whichever one he would allow, the evil would be defeated. Nevertheless, in the counterfactual sense, it would be gratuitous. So it feels to me like the really threatening notion of gratuitous is not merely balanced off, but you didn't really need it to get this kind of good. So that's what I'm going to assume from now on. All right, so what are some ways out of this argument? This is on your handout. I guess we're still in section 3, yeah. Wait, no, we're shifting to 4. I think we're shifting to 4. I'll let you know in a minute. Look at 3 ways to question the argument. One way to question it is to say the first premise is false. Allowing gratuitous evils that one could prevent is consistent with being perfectly good and benevolent. Now, why in the world might you think that that's true? Well, one reason you might think it's true is you might think that there are cases like the one I was just describing. Cases where some bad stuff is needed, but there's no minimum amount. In that case, if God allows any of it, you could say God's allowed some gratuitous evil because God could have gotten by with a little bit less. Okay? So if there's ever a case like that, then the first premise is false. And you have people like Peter Van Inwagen, arguing that there certainly are cases like that. He argues for it on the grounds of the vagueness of human goods. I'd like to argue for it on other grounds, but anyway, that's a reason to take that first option. Number 2, the second premise is false. All the evils that appear gratuitous are actually serving some good purpose. It's just that lots of them, we have no idea what it is. Number 3, the disjunction of the 2 premises is false. There's good reason for God to create a world that at least appears to include gratuitous evils, and so reason either to allow them to occur, in which case 1 would be false, or at least to seem to occur, in which case 2 would be false. So you can reject the first premise categorically, reject the second categorically, or have a kind of mixed option where I don't know if there's gratuitous evil or not, but there's good reason for it to seem like there is. And now, why would you think that third one? The second one is tough. The second one, there's lots and lots of evil where we can hardly imagine any purpose for it. The third one, though, has a plausibility to it because we can think of good reasons for God to leave some bad states of affairs seem to be gratuitous. After all, if every bad thing that ever happened to any other human being in my circles, every bad thing clearly, obviously, had a role to play that was overall good for that person, well, that would radically affect our relationship and our ability to be in have morally significant ties to one another. It wouldn't matter what I do, because I can see that no matter how much pain or suffering or how much I leave you in the dark and ignorant about something, it's all going to be for the good. And if that was obvious to me, well, it wouldn't matter what I did. And so again, morality would be undermined, as Bill Hasker puts it. So that gives us a reason to think that either there really is gratuitous evil, or at least it's going to appear to be. The world is going to appear to be such that there is gratuitous evil. Okay, now quickly let me look at an argument of Bill Rowe's for the conclusion that you're going to have to go with two. And the reason you're going to have to go with two is because that first premise is just ruled out. A perfectly good, benevolent being could not allow gratuitous evil. And this is somewhat modified. He puts it in terms of overall possible worlds. And he says, well, what would happen if there was no greatest possible world? I don't think God's in the position of creating a world all at once. With free creatures in it, who knows which way it's going to go? Now, maybe God foreknows, but if the creatures are really free, I don't think God just sort of decides what the world is going to be like. Still, God sets things up so that certain goods are served by certain evils, and if there are circumstances like that one, where some bad stuff is needed but there's no minimal amount, God is involved in allowing some gratuitous evil. And Rowe has a principle that would seem to rule that out. It's principle B. Of course, there's a principle A in Rowe's book, or in his original article, but you don't get to see that. So this is principle B on the handout, page 2. If an omniscient being creates a world when there's a better world it could create, then it would be possible for there to be a being morally better than it. And I think this will lead us to a Rowe-style argument. I say for premise 1. That's not what I mean, is it? It's a, oh yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, it's a Rowe-style argument for premise 1 and against the first of my 3 responses, and also the third. Okay? So this is an argument for premise 1 of the original argument. Because it's sort of in line with those, the first premise is 3. If there's gratuitous evil, in other words, if there's a situation like that case where some evil has to be allowed but God could have gotten along with less, then if there were an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good and benevolent God, this God would be responsible for the existence of a world with a certain value when it could have had a better world instead. If such a God were responsible for the existence of a world with a certain value when it could have had a better world instead, then it's possible for there to be a world W, the one with this gratuitous evil in it, such that God exists in that world, and it's possible that some being, God or some other being, be morally better than God is in W. Namely, in a world where the God or whoever gets along with less of this bad stuff. That's an implication, I think, of Rowe's principle B. If there is a God, then it's impossible for there to be a world, W, such that God exists in W, and it's possible that some being, God or some other being, is morally better than God is in W. That's a way of saying God is a necessarily unsurpassable being. This is a principle that Rowe appeals to, and I'm willing to accept it. If you've got a being, and that being is God, you can't find a better being anywhere. And that being couldn't have been better, couldn't have been morally better than it is. And then you get your conclusion, which is equivalent to the first premise of the original argument. No gratuitous evil in a world with God. Now, I'm suspicious of this argument. It assumes this principle B, which is basically which you could call an expression principle. The degree of goodness of a being is going to be expressed by the goodness of the outcome, the goodness of the act that's chosen. So a being that allows this much evil to get the 100 good is not as good a being as the being who's not prepared to allow that much evil, but will only allow less. The intuitive idea is, if God settles for a certain amount of evil when less could have been used to get the same good results, then God's not as good as God could be. But what I want to say is this kind of expression principle is dubious when you're dealing with infinitely many options. Compare this expression principle, B star. If an ideal runner is willing to settle for n miles per hour to get from A to B, but could have gone faster, then it's possible for someone to have a stronger desire to get from A to B. Now, an ideal runner is one, let's pretend that relativity is false and that there's no upper limit to speed. The ideal runner is one who can choose any finite speed to get from here to there. So this runner can't instantaneously jump from one place to another. But for any speed you like, this ideal runner could get there that quickly. Now, suppose we had a non-ideal runner. There would be an upper limit to this runner's speed. It might be plausible to suppose that an expression principle is true about this runner. That if the runner had wanted it more, she would have chosen a faster speed if she doesn't choose the highest speed. Now, in the case of an ideal runner, though, there is no highest speed. Should we say, well, I guess they didn't want it as much as they could have? That's not at all obvious. Take another expression principle, B double star. This is the principle that the certainty of a certain kind of gambler will be expressed in the amount of money that is bet. So an ideal gambler is one that knows the odds and always acts in accordance with them. If an ideal gambler is willing to bet N dollars on a horse, but could have bet more, then it's possible for someone to be more certain that the horse would win. Well, suppose the ideal gambler is told, actually, you probably didn't realize this, but there's the amount of money in the universe is much higher than any number that you could ever conceive of. Maybe there's lots more universes out there, and there's an exchange rate. I don't know. But so for any amount that you can conceive of, any dollar amount you can conceive of, there actually is more. And what's more, we have it. We can give you that amount, and you can place it on your next bet. Now, that ideal gambler has suddenly been put in a position where, for any amount that they choose to place on this horse, they could have put more on the horse. Does that mean that they suddenly became uncertain that the horse would win? That's ridiculous. Right? Does this mean there's no upper limit to certainty? There's no such thing as absolute certainty? I would think that this would be no kind of argument that there's no such thing as absolute certainty. And I think we should take the same attitude towards Rowe's principle B. It seems plausible when we're thinking, as we always think, about finite range of options, where there's always a best that you can do. You might be tied with some other things, but you don't have any cases where there's infinitely many options before you. When we're neglecting that sort of situation, principle B seems plausible. When it becomes salient, as it would have to be to
God, in the case of God, then it's not at all obvious that B is true, and that a perfectly good and benevolent being couldn't allow some gratuitous evil. So I think that doesn't give us a reason to rule out that first premise. And the wise theodicist may not want to go down the road of proposing precise goods for all the evils that you're going to be able to think up and throw at me in the question period. But the wise theodicist can at least continue to suppose that the first and the third alternatives are reasonable ones to take in theodicy. Thanks. And I guess I can take my own questions, and if there's no need for a break as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So I wanted to speak on the road a tiny bit.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so I'm really convinced that on the basis of the analogies that B is going to have to be false. Like say on your ideal.
There's
the purpose of the analogy?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
B, yeah. B looks
looks
false.
bad, yeah.
Looks at least it's very suspicious.
Yeah, it's very suspicious.
Yeah.
So, you know, the gambler, got to choose some route, right?
Right.
There's always going to be a better route. But there are some constraints on being ideal, right? So if we have our gambler, the gambler could, you know, bet in infinite amounts, you know, clearly the ideal gambler is going to like bet more than $1. Like that's going to be a really terrible gambler.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Yes. Exactly. It's not as though once the ideal gambler is told you can pick any finite sum that you can think of,
Yeah.
it's like he remains the ideal gambler even if he chooses $1.
Yeah, that's right. Or if, you know, the ideal runner walks along.
I can choose any finite speed whatsoever. I really want to get there, but there's no max, so I'll just.
Yeah. So my thought is that one would be ruled out, right? Because gratuitous evils are, you know, like the equivalent of betting $1 or walking along the track, right? The idea being sort of go back to, you know, your motivation for option 3, the third way to question the argument. So the thought is there's good reason for God to create a world that at least appears to contain gratuitous evils. Now you sort of have two options, right, for God. God could create a world that genuinely contains gratuitous evils, or God could create a world that contains really convincing appearances, right? And my thought, I don't know how to make this into sort of a beat triple prime. My thought is that the sort of, you know, it's just as obvious that you want to, you know, God would choose the mere appearances as it is, you know, or at least not choose the genuine gratuitous evils as it is, you know, be a runner or walk or anything.
Yeah. The only thing I can think of that militates against that, but it's something which has a pull on me, is a kind of Cartesian thought, you know, where there's one thing about God: God's not a deceiver. You know, that's of course very important for Descartes' whole setup. So there might be a trade-off here in goodness between absence of deceptiveness in the sort of created order, versus absence of gratuitous evil. So, I mean, there's another argument in the vicinity that Rowe actually gives, which is in the vicinity of your response to the runner and the gambler. The response is, well, I don't know if there's any cases like that, but I can tell you one thing: if there are cases like that, God shouldn't have chosen here. God should have allowed much less badness. So there's no good that could require this this particular evil. That sort of thing. But that's not the heart of what you were after. You were saying there's a kind of general reason to think that between these choices, gratuitous seeming only and actually gratuitous, God should choose the first. I mean, there's a part of me that says, well, one should hope so. You know, it'd be nice to think that, you know, that somehow. But then the more I think about that, I realize, well, if there's a trade-off between the disvalue of deception, you know, things looking bad when they're not really bad, my not knowing this, my living in somewhat of a illusory world. If that really is a disvalue, it really wouldn't make sense to say, well, you know, God could have done either way. Either way would be equally good, but I hope he did it the way where there's no gratuitous evil, because then I'm hoping that there's this other bad stuff, the ignorance. So maybe it's tender-minded of me to hope that it's ignorance that explains the appearance of the gratuitous evil, but I have that reaction too. Oops, did I do that? I'm fine.
Okay, so I took it the sort of good thing about strategy 3 was that you avoid having to sort of give an elaborate explanation or, you know, all sorts of apparently gratuitous and those sort of thing, issues. You didn't want to go just back to that, right?
Yeah.
But my thought is that, you know, pushing this sort of disvalue deception line probably might not get you all you want on that front, right? So even if deception has some disvalue, right, I think it's probably implausible that it's going to be enough disvalue for us to sort of endorse the following. Every apparent gratuitous evil is a genuine gratuitous evil, right? I think there are going to be lots of like pretty extreme gratuitous evils such that their evil outweighs any disvalue you would get from deception, right? So, you know, public sort of outweighing deception and gratuitous evil, you're still going to be forced to see the place of sort of giving a
Yeah.
the fantasy type explanation.
No, I think that's.
Might not be too complicated.
I think that's right. It shows the limits of this third option, which is when it seems like the disvalue of deceptiveness just couldn't come anywhere close to the same, having the same weight as the disvalue of this terrible suffering or whatever. Then you're back in the business of either going mystery, there's a mystery good that's served by this that we don't understand, or trying to, you know, make some sense out of it. It might, if you actually turn the screws on me and, you know, try to get me responding to the problem of evil, it's going to be you're going to get a mixed strategy where you know, I try to make some pretty bad stuff seem like, in the context of a much bigger world than you think there might be, they make sense or could make sense. and saying, I don't know. The mixed strategy will involve trying to soften you up with cases where it's like, well, this you might have thought would be impossible, but here's something. So maybe there's other things we haven't thought of. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question about this sort of asymptotic scenario you've got here. So what I'm wondering is if you think this requires you to deny a kind of strong version of the principle of sufficient reason, and if so, if that might saddle us with not only some epistemological worries, but some metaphysical worries as well. So I guess what I'm thinking is, suppose that there's some range where, just like with the ideal gambler, if he bet $1, we'd sort of think he wasn't quite so ideal. Maybe here, if God allows -9, we wouldn't think he's quite so ideal. But suppose it's really low within a certain acceptable range. Would we be forced to accept that if we were to ask God, why this amount, why not a little bit less, that metaphysically there's no answer. God can't give a reason or doesn't have a reason for choosing that amount. Sort of a Leibnizian.
Yeah. I think the presence of gratuitous evil for this kind of reason, where there's no minimal amount that's necessary, it's like supposing there's no best possible world. And Leibniz is going to think there has to be a best possible world, because God couldn't do anything. God doesn't choose anything without a reason. God has to choose something. The reason has to be compelling to rule out alternatives. So there's only one possible world. Now, I just don't find that picture of things compelling at all. And the idea that there's no best possible world seems very plausible to me. So I think I'm happy to go down that road.
I'm not in the theology class. I'm just a stranger here.
I'm an amateur myself. So.
I have one question, because I couldn't follow the logic and the math and the abstraction and the quantification. A question and a comment. The question is, a person who's been through the Holocaust, how would you speak to that person in plain, ordinary terms, according to the view that you've offered? Now, the comment, that's the question, comment, is that the term God, so frequently used, begins to create an image of a person, as though God were a person. Because if you listen to all that was said, that's what it sounds like. I think that, and I'm sure you wouldn't think that, but I mean, this is what happens. I think of that creator being there such. I feel it. I feel him or her or it, because we don't have the words for it, as a presence with a capital P. And I feel it more and more at certain times and some less at other times. And it seems to me that as we come to feel that presence, it's not obvious. When you say obvious, it's out, sensation kind of thing. For me, that wouldn't be the case. And I think in terms of evolution, I wrote a book on evolution from the Big Bang, because nobody knows, there's no theory of evolution. Natural selection does not apply to atoms and molecules and so on. And by the way, a molecule is something different than all of its atom parts. Oxygen is not just, or water is not just oxygen. I think I'm...
So there may be an organic unity there.
Yeah, yes, I'm just referring to that.
Yeah.
And I've always asked this question. This is why I'm here. Why suffering? And I've thought to myself that maybe because this is such a powerful, powerful being with such a presence, being that's becoming through us also, that as we feel and act in accordance with that presence, as would, let's say, Buddha and Nirvana and Christ in his Christhood and Buddhahood, as we move in that direction, to become that kind of universal that exists, apparently latent within ourselves, we are, in a sense, aiding one another. So it's a community affair right from the beginning. And in evolution, I should stop, and in evolution, we gradually increase our free will by virtue of the fact that we're becoming more and more inwardly conscious, from snake to frog to lion to human to Homo erectus, in terms of what we can do. We're increasing our freedom in that respect. So that's my comment, and I wonder if you could just speak to me as a Holocaust survivor.
Well, one thing is, I'll save that to the end, to a second, but the hard things last. The extent to which God is conceived of as something behind the appearances that we describe in personal terms, but those are not, those can't be taken seriously. And if you can think of God as somehow a function of consciousness, of everybody's consciousness or something like that, if you think of God in those terms, then these kind of moral principles about the choices of an agent are not really appropriate. And so this gets you out of some aspects of the problem of evil simply because you're saying, look, God's not an agent like you or me. God's not choosing between A and B for reasons in a conscious sort of way. So so going down that road obviously is going to put you in a completely different kind of dialectic from this one. Now, that being said, I think this argument, this sort of argument, problem of evil type arguments, they don't just stop having any bite to them once you say, I don't want to use anthropomorphic language to describe God, or something like that. So, you got all the medieval theologians in, both Jewish and Christian ones, like Maimonides and Aquinas, and you've got them making all these, they're hedging what they mean when they say God is all-knowing, or God is all-powerful, and God is good, and so on. And they say, well, it's different from what we say when we talk about ourselves. Still, they face a severe problem of evil because they basically want to say, God's not good like you or me, but even better. God's not powerful like you and me, even more powerful. It's I think, merely making let's not be anthropomorphic, merely making that move doesn't make the problem of evil go away. But making the kind of move that you were describing helps a great deal. Now, with respect to what to say to the survivors of particular horrors, it gives me, I shudder when I open some books by some dear friends of mine who do philosophy of religion, who talk about the value of letting the ordinary run-of-the-mill, German camp workers and guards have their free will to, decide whether to, have any compassion or not. That this outweighs the horror of this huge event. I mean, I don't. It's like the case of, well, can the badness of this little bit of deception outweigh this horribleness? It brings the same kind of reaction. So I think the best that the theodicist, the wise theodicist, what they should say to anybody who's suffering something horrible, something that seems unbearable, the sickness and premature death of your child, or something terrible like that. The right response is not, well, there's got to be a reason, and I'm sure it'll all work out for the best, and blah blah blah. And this isn't the response of the traditions we're talking about either. I mean, it remains quite mysterious what the point of, say, Job's suffering was. In fact, God says, you wouldn't understand, basically, is what God says out of the whirlwind. That's not a very satisfying answer, but it's the answer that Job gets. I mean, when you get in the Christian scriptures, Jesus' attitude towards suffering and sickness and so on is clearly, this is horrible. And when people say, well, it must be because this person's parents did this or that or whatever, he says, no, it's not like that. It's horrible, and it's not their fault. The tower falls on 18 people and kills them. Jesus says, do you suppose they were any worse than anybody else? No, they weren't. So there's a refusal to come up with specific explanations of specific evils. I think you can see that as actually a very good thing, because to the extent that we're going to remain responsible for one another, we have to see the bad things that are happening as things that must be stopped, and things that aren't somehow secretly doing somebody some good. And then I will fall silent. Yeah, you were. By what? So which? Well, I thought so what part of the? I'm not sure that you wanted me to go through the argument more carefully and show the logical form of it, right? You wanted me to respond to, what do you say to this concrete case of horrible evil, right? Or was there a particular argument where you wanted to see the logical form of it? Because I think you probably, like the argument at the top of the handout, that was, I'm sure that's the form of it was pretty clear. Is that true? Or what part of it did you think? Well, that's what I had why 1 and 3 are viable. You mean well, I merely gestured towards Peter Van Inwagen's reasons for thinking that there are cases like this, where some bad stuff is needed for certain larger goods, but there's no minimal amount. So I only gave you an abstract kind of description of that case, and not a strong argument that it is the case. But I think you can see that if there were such a case, then there could be gratuitous evil, as long as Roe is wrong in that other that argument that I gave you. Now, the kinds of case that Van Inwagen has in mind is cases where to take the non-obviousness of God case. To some extent, it has to be unclear to us that God is real, God is present, God cares intensely about my decisions and my character, and that has to be somewhat non-obvious to us if we're going to remain rational and morally responsible and so on. Okay? But there might be no minimum to the obviousness. There might not be no smallest amount, which is the ideal amount. And if there wasn't a smallest amount, then for any amount, God could have gotten by with a little bit less ignorance. And similarly for other cases where something bad seems like it's a part of something good. So the kinds of dangers that are needed for courage, the kinds of harms that I have to be able to do in order for me to also be able to help you. If there's nothing that I can do that matters to you, I can't be helping you at all. Now exactly how much? Well, perhaps there's no minimum. It's that sort of case that Van Inwagen points towards. And that makes one plausible, and thereby makes the third one plausible too, which is just the disjunction.
Thank you. All right, so I noticed earlier you used a sort of analogy saying that, you know, sometimes doctors have to make people suffer in their treatment of them, which is definitely true. Let's say you have to amputate someone's foot to save the entirety of their life, right? But doctors are are just people with medical training. They aren't omnipotent per se. Why precisely God being omnipotent, though, by definition? Why does he need to rely on gratuitous evils, defeated evils, or balanced evils to achieve a positive result? Could he not make something that was just inherently good, circumventing such rules like the problems with the free wills and automatons? And if there are rules and boundaries that prevent him from creating infinite utility for everyone that he has to obey, wouldn't it make more sense to sort of worship these rules and boundaries? And why would you choose to worship him over the series of rules that he too has to sort of be bound by?
Excuse me. I'm not sure what happened there at the end, the thing about the rules and so on. So let me bracket that for the moment, and then I'll try to figure out exactly the nature of that part of your question. Let me take the other part where I was tracking you pretty well, I think. Basically, it's why, so doctors can't heal this guy without amputating the limb. An omnipotent doctor could.
Yes.
All right. Now, the free will defense says there are some things that require the risk of evil that can't be gotten even by omnipotence, just by choosing them. There's some goods. So you could, the crazy smart scientist could create the world of the happy robots, but that wouldn't be a world where there was genuine, and then list all the virtues: compassion, forgiveness, courage, so on and so forth, even if it looked like there was. The free will defender says that would still be true if the creatures were made out of flesh and bone and blood and were programmed to behave in that way, were determined to behave in that way. So the free will defender wants to say directly bringing that about is like directly bringing about a contradiction. So it's just not possible. So that's the example that the free will defender will give of at least one good state of affairs that requires at least the risk of badness. And furthermore, the actual badness of bad motives, which are going to be required for these creatures to be actually free to do good and evil. So that's their response and my response, for that matter, to the, if God were omnipotent, he could just bring about any good that's worth having directly with no risk. But the next thing you were saying, I didn't quite follow. It was like, if God
Do you want me to clarify a bit then?
Yeah.
Okay, so I understand that there are certain like a series of benefits that one cannot get without free will, right? But provided that God is, well, capable of anything per se, could God hypothetically do the impossible and get these benefits that cannot be gotten without free will? And given that if he can't, then doesn't that mean there are a series of rules that he has to follow, meaning that there is in fact something sort of greater than him?
So it sounds like you're saying if God can't bring about the impossible, God's not as good as a being who could bring about the impossible. And I'm not going to accept that. Right?
Okay.
I guess I'll step up to bat again for Roe. I just want to push you on this analogy a little bit. So I'll tell you what I heard and why I thought the analogy didn't work, and you can shoot back. I take it you interpret the principle B to express what you called an expression principle, where God's moral goodness is something that can be judged.
It has to be expressed.
It has to be expressed.
It's going to come out in this way.
Right. So wouldn't the analogy to the gambler be the gambler's being a good gambler? And wouldn't the analogy to the runner be the runner's being a good runner, rather than specifically the runner's exhibiting a desire to get from A to B, or the gambler's desire or the gambler's certainty that X would win? So it seems to me the analogical B prime and B prime prime should be phrased as, if an ideal runner is willing to settle for such a speed when that runner could have ran faster, then that runner is not the best possible runner. The runner is not as good of a runner as that runner could have been, where the desire to get from A to B is only part of what makes a runner a good runner in that particular case. And that seems even clearer to me in the case of the gambler, since a good gambler would be judged by more than just the certainty with which, the probability that the gambler calculated, but some sort of relation to how much so-and-so would bet. And, just to spell this out, if we were to write the analogies this way, then Roe could just accept, so for any given ideal gambler, there could have been a better gambler. That's not a reason to say that this was a bad gambler, but just not as good as the gambler could have been, so God isn't as good as God could have been, even if God is still somehow good anyway.
Let me try to make clear the way in which I wanted the analogies to run. In the case of God, what you've given to God is knowledge and power to choose amongst a range of options, okay? To choose any of them. In the case of the runner, what you've given the runner and making the runner ideal is the ability to get from point A to point B with any speed that's chosen within this range. In the case of the ideal gambler, what you've given the gambler is the ability to compute odds perfectly and to choose to bet the amount of money that the gambler deems appropriate in any given bet. Okay, so that's the idealness of them is that they're given this power to choose. The thing that's expressed in the case of God, it's not the power, it's the goodness of the being. And the idea is this feature of the being is going to be expressed by the choice that's made in this range that the being has the ability to choose over. Okay? And in the case of the runner, what's expressed is the desire to get from one place to another. And it's sort of natural. If there's no other factors at play, like there's no other reason why the runner would want to slow down. The runner doesn't have anybody who she cares about that she wants to bring along with her or anything like that. It would be natural to think that your speed would, your choice from this range of speeds would express your desire to get there. And in the case of the gambler, it's natural to think that the amount of certainty is going to determine the amount of your money that you're going to bet. I don't know if that helps, but those seem natural principles until you think of the infinite case. And then you realize, oh, well, if there is the infinite case, then either there's no such thing as maximum desire for this runner, or there's no such thing as maximum certainty, or these principles are false. I don't know. Did that help to clarify the things that were being compared?
Yeah, well, so I followed you in the first place. I followed you when you went through the examples. I was just a little confused why you would set up the gambling example to take certainty as the thing that his gambling is a natural expression of. So I'm just trying to repeat what I was saying earlier a little more clearly.
Well,
Go ahead.
So the thing that's ideal about the gambler is her ability to compute odds and to bet accordingly. I'm not quite sure. One aspect of the gambler's character is going to be the degree of certainty to which the gambler assigns different outcomes. Mm-hmm. Given her ideal nature, she's going to place bets in accordance with, there's going to be a lot of things involved here besides just certainty. There's the odds and the amount of money that, with the payoff and so on. So there's certainty about the outcomes, and then there's proper estimation of the worth of the outcomes. Yeah. And she's going to be able to calculate all that stuff perfectly. one thing that's going to feed into her choices is the amount of certainty that she has. Normally, that is not in the infinite case, the amount of certainty, if it's, if she's absolutely certain about something, she's going to put as much as she can on it. But not, in this case, she can't express that certainty by doing that sort of action. I still feel like maybe you've got your finger on a disanalogy or problem that I haven't quite grasped.
Well, it might just help if you're going to rehearse this in the future to walk through exactly what the points of comparisons are between being a moral agent, making a decision under ideal conditions regarding achieving some good, and being a gambling agent, making decisions regarding a bet under ideal conditions so as to achieve what exactly.
What it is that's being expressed and what the ideal stuff is. Yeah, I certainly I moved very quickly when I got to that point because I was realizing how long I'd made you all sit here. Yeah. There's somebody in the front row here, next to you.
Thanks. I guess I'd like to know what you think of the limited God option as a possible solution, so that if you're truly convinced there must be a God or there is a God, but you also look at the argument that you have up on the board and think, yeah, that just doesn't work, then you could go the route of saying, all right, well, there's a God and there's evil, so it must be a limited God. But I'm wondering if you think that just leads to more philosophical troubles than it would possibly solve. Then you'd have to explain what is this God that's a limited God, and it's a superior being but not a supreme being. So do you think that's even a kind of a viable path to consider?
I think it belongs on the table. I think it all depends on what your reasons are for believing that God exists. If your reasons for thinking that God exists are largely experiential, the kind of sense that you were talking about of the presence of something that's behind all of this in some sense. If they're experiential and if they convince you of the holiness and goodness of the being, well, then limitations in power or knowledge or something would be a conclusion you could draw from this that I think wouldn't be at all crazy to draw that conclusion. I think if you are if your reasons for believing in God might include that, but also include a whole lot of other stuff, for instance, commitment to the reliability of a particular theological tradition, then it's going to become harder to make that move. I mean, just as a matter of fact, when theologians make that move, they devise a kind of theological system which quickly withers and dies. And I don't mean that in it gets refuted. I just mean it doesn't lead to more and more people believing it, and eventually you have people worshiping together, and that just doesn't happen. There's something about the utterly exalted sort of nature of the omni-God that attracts us, and the atheist is going to say, yeah, it attracts us like a moth to the flame, and there's these explanations from cognitive science that explain why we go that way, and we just can't help it, but that's not a reason to not draw that conclusion. It's just a sort of as a matter of fact, that's the direction that we seem to be pulled. Personally, I think it's, it's far better to have this very exalted conception of God and not be sure whether God exists, than to be sure that God exists but think that maybe God's kind of a bastard, Now, and
Not on purpose. He's limited.
no, right. So there's this third option, which is certain that God exists, certain that God is very, very good, but not sure how powerful God is. And that doesn't seem to me to have the negative consequences of the, well, I guess I better cringe before this probably pretty awful being. It doesn't have that at all. It's just that it turns out not to be a religiously live option for very many people.
On that note, maybe we should stop. I know there are a number of questions still, but we should, especially given all that's going on in the square tonight, draw to a close. But please feel free to come ask Professor Zimmerman questions. Thank you all. There's some please grab a Halloween treat on your way out. Thank you for a fine lecture.